Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to do some final wrap-ups for the year of 2023. This is going to be a few statistics and then my 23 favorites of 2023. It was a hell of a reading year. I read a lot of books, a lot of pages, and it was really hard narrowing my list of favorites down. So before we jump straight into the books, I just want to go over a handful of statistics for my reading. In the year 2023, I managed to read 281 books. That's a total of 93,340 pages, and that averages out to 332 pages per book. In terms of page number breakdown, 34% of my reads were under 300 pages. 62% of my reads were between 300 to 500 pages, and only 5% of my reads were over 500 pages. So you can see that I have a definite preference for like a mid-range book. In terms of nonfiction to fiction, I had 8% nonfiction, that is 23 books. That's almost 2 books a month, which isn't too bad, but in terms of a percentage of the books that I read, it is not very high. I definitely want to work on improving that in 2024. 92% of the books that I read were fiction, and that's about 258 books total. My top genres were literary fiction with 82 books falling into that category. Fantasy was 75 books. Historical fiction was 69 books. Contemporary fiction with 57 books. And LGBTQIA with 47 books. My most read authors in 2023 were Shannon McGuire with 8 books, and that's because I read the entirety of the Wayward Children series, which is a series of short novellas. Nevo with 4 books, which is because I read her entire Singing Hills cycle. There's 4 books published. Neil Schusterman with 4 because I read the entire Arc of Scythe series. There's 4 books for that as well. Yiyun Lee with 3 books, and Jennifer Saint with 3 books. So now we're going to talk about my 23 favorite books of 2023, but we're going to start with some honorable mentions first, because there are a couple books that I agonized about whether they should be on the list or they should just be honorable mentions, and so I wouldn't feel right if I didn't mention them. So the first of my honorable mentions is The Changeling by Victor LaValle. This is kind of a fantasy, horror, folkloric tale, and this isn't going to be the type of book for everybody. I, in fact, feel like it is probably pretty polarizing. Some people are going to love it and some people are going to hate it, but it centers around a family in New York City. The woman becomes pregnant and starts exhibiting signs of postpartum depression. She is feeling alienated and isolated, and she's convinced that her baby is not actually her baby, but been replaced. This leads her to commit an atrocious act of violence and then sends the husband on a journey to try to figure out what happened to his wife and his child. The reason that I really enjoyed this book is because it was so unique. I don't think I've ever read anything like it. I know that a critique I've seen of it is that it feels like it's 2 different stories. You have one set in the real world and then one set in a fantasy world, but I actually kind of like that, because when you're dealing with something extraordinarily traumatic, as this gentleman is in this book, I feel like some people kind of slip off into a fantasy world as a coping mechanism. So whether you read the book as literally having happened to him, or you read it as this fantasy world that he's created to explain what his wife has done, I think it's a pretty fantastic read. My second honorable mention is The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek. This was a book that was recommended to me by Melinda at A Web of Stories, and it was a fantastic recommendation. I had never read any sort of Norse mythology before, so this was a completely new experience. This book is also a little bit quirky and a little bit crazy, but I'm kind of learning that that's a thing with Norse mythology. I thought overall that the writing was really done. Our main character was very compelling, and I absolutely devoured this story. If you like quirky and weird and strange and you're interested in Norse mythology, this is a book you might enjoy as well. Then I had The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks. This was a book that actually took me a little bit of time to get into. The start of it was a little bit slow. We have this family dynamic and there's a hurricane, and I wasn't loving the way that it started, but the ending and where it went from there was so magical and so interesting, and I didn't see any of it coming. It was a really great surprise, and it was a kind of a tale of 2 stories, but the ending for me really turned it around. I think that's the only reason I didn't put it in the actual 23 list, was just because the beginning dragged a bit. My final honorable mention is We Are Not Like Them by Joe Piazza and Christine Pride. This is a book about unjustified police shootings, but it's told from 2 different perspectives. We have 2 people who are best friends, one a white woman married to a police officer who is at fault for an unjust killing of a young Black person, and her best friend who is a Black woman and very socially and politically active. It's such an interesting way to look at this story, to see both perspectives and how people feel in these types of scenarios. Even though I didn't particularly agree with the white woman in the story or a lot of her perspective, it was interesting seeing this particular issue through both sides. I did think that this was a really thought-provoking read, and if you're interested in books that have really relevant current themes and are very emotional explorations, this might be a book that you should pick up. Okay, so now that we have honorable mentions out of the way, we're gonna go through the top 23. These are in order to the best of my ability. I may at some point move some around a little bit, but for the most part, this is how they ranked for me. Book number 23 is All the Dangerous Things by Stacey Willingham. This is a thriller, and I was as surprised as you probably are to see a thriller on my list. But the thing that Stacey Willingham did so successfully here is that she wrote a thriller without filling it full of these just crazy, insane plot twists that you know are just not plausible and never gonna happen. Instead, we have a woman who is just struggling with grief. Her child has gone missing, her marriage has fallen apart, and she seems to be the only person that's really invested in figuring out what happened in this case. She teams up with a podcaster and they start to make some headway on this very cold case. And the conclusion, while it wasn't like the most shocking conclusion ever in the history of thrillers, I appreciated that it was a conclusion that actually could have happened, and I wasn't sitting there going, oh, aliens did it. If you're a fan of thrillers, especially if you're like me and you get really frustrated with overly twisty thrillers, this is probably one to pick. Number 22 was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is a book that's not going to be for everyone. It's a little bit abstract and vague. There's not a solid conclusion, so know that going into it if you decide to read it. But this book is about two wives, one who stays home and one who goes on a super secret deep sea mission, and then something goes wrong with the submarine she's on and she is trapped under the sea for a long period of time. When she returns home, she is not her normal self. There are all sorts of eerie and creepy things that are happening, and it puts an obvious strain on their marriage. We see the book through both wives' perspectives, and I found it really fascinating. I'm beginning to realize that at times I do like a good vague book that doesn't answer all the questions for you and leaves you some room to think about what's happening. That's this book. Again, like I said, this won't be for everyone. I've seen some critique of this, that it's too abstract and too vague and that it seems a little pretentious, but for me, it didn't register that way. I actually really enjoyed. Book number 21 is The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This was a book that was picked out for me by Hannah over at Savage Reads, and this was an excellent pick. This is a historical fiction with a sprinkling of fantasy. It follows three sisters. There's feminism, there's magic, there's just, what's not to like about that, really? I could probably spout on about this, but I don't want to like ruin the book or give too much away. If you like historical fiction, if you like a little bit of fantasy sprinkled in, if you especially like a feminist storyline, then you should definitely check out this book. Book number 20 is A Shadow in Moscow by Catherine Ray. This is a Cold War era Soviet Union spy novel. We have two different female spies that are operating within Russia, passing on secret intel to Britain and the United States. This was a fascinating read. First of all, the characters were so compelling in this. I loved both women who were operatives. They were so brave, they were so bold, and I also love how they both got involved. Like, it's not as straightforward as you would think. I thought that the setting was really well done. There's just so many things that I loved about this book, and I'm a really big fan of historical fiction. I end up reading quite a bit of it. It was in my top 5 genres for the year, and this was definitely heads and shoulders above the rest. This stood out for the period that it was placed in, for the description of Russia, the fact that it featured two badass women doing badass things, all things that I really love. If, like me, you love a historical fiction, then I highly recommend this one. Number 19 was Yellow Wife by Sadiqa Johnson. This book was one that I read way back in February, and it is a book that has haunted me since. This book is not for the faint of heart. It is about slavery and about horrific choices that people have to make to protect themselves and their children. In this case, we have a woman who is of a lighter complexion, so she initially is protected by her white father, but when he dies, her stepmother sells her off into slavery. She then ends up marrying a jailer at a slave prison and bearing him children in order to protect the child that she already has. It's horrific and brutal. One of the most unflinching portrayals of slavery that I think I have read in any book. And there are certain scenes that, like, to this day still haunt me. If you read this, please know going into it that it is extremely heavy with trigger warnings, but it is also a fantastically done historical fiction. And I think Sadiqa Johnson is a brilliant author. I can't wait to read more of her writing. Number 18 was The Book of Goose by Yiyun Lee. This is a book that is really also very strange. I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot in this list. This is literary fiction. It is about two girls growing up in France. They kind of dream of writing a book. One girl actually writes the book, but she's kind of an unlikable character. Nobody in town likes her. She just seems to grate on everybody's nerves. So she convinces her best friend to take credit for the book. Best friend agrees, takes credit for the book. They submit it to publishers, jokingly, they don't expect anything to come of it, but the book blows up and she becomes like the debut author of the year. To me, this felt like a strong critique, at least, or possibly a borderline satire of the publishing industry and like the publishing darlings. I thought this book was really clever and witty. It's a little all over the place, and again, like I said, kind of quirky, but I really loved it, and it sent me down a rabbit hole of Yiyun Lee's writing. Number 17 is Five Little Indians by Michelle Good. This is a book I read in November and is still, stuck in my brain months later. This follows 5 friends who are sent to a residential school in Canada where they are brutalized and tormented. And then on their 18th birthday, they are basically dropped off at a bus station with no money, no resources, and no support. They all make it to downtown Vancouver into a pretty seedy district, and this is about what they all have to do to survive. This book is written in a very sparse style. This isn't super literary. It's very direct and to the point. I actually think though that this makes the book more poignant because it's not flowery, it's not softened, it's just the cold hard fact on the page. This is another book that has some pretty heavy trigger warnings in it, so if you're thinking about reading, check those out first. It is definitely worth the effort though. Number 16 is Lady Tan's Circle of Women by Lisa C. I've read several books by Lisa C and I always enjoy them. This one was one of my favorite historical fiction reads of the year. This book follows the woman who becomes basically China's first female doctor. She, as a young woman, is born into a Chinese noble family. Her feet are bound, and she is destined for a life of playing instruments, looking beautiful, bearing sons, and sewing slippers for bound feet. But then her grandparents take her in and teach her Chinese medicine. They raise her to think critically, to question everything, and above all else, to treat and help people. They also introduce her at a young age to the daughter of a midwife. And midwives are kind of looked down upon in this era because they're, touching blood and dealing with, the gore of childbirth, whereas a proper doctor in China at the time would never touch blood or bodily fluids. But the two hit it off, and together they train and they learn everything there is to learn about medicine. This book was just fascinating. I learned a lot about an era I knew very little about. I learned a ton about medicine and the development of medicine. I learned about bound feet. It just is a fascinating book. There's so much information in it, and somehow Lisa C keeps the narrative flow while she's just giving you buckets full of information. Number 15 is Independence by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. This is a book that is about the partition between India and Pakistan. It follows several different sisters as they're trapped in various positions around the partition. This book covers a lot in a very short span of pages, but it didn't suffer for it. In fact, I actually felt like it made the book move so fast I couldn't put it down. I think I read this entire book in like a day, maybe a day and a half if I remember correctly, and I just devoured it. I had to know what was going to happen, if the sisters were going to reunite. It's one of those books that reads like a thriller, except it's a historical fiction. Number 14 was Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. This is a horror with some magical realism elements sprinkled in, and really it's mostly about grief. We have a woman who is grieving the loss of her sister, and in that grief, she has stayed away from home. She has cut contact with most of her family members, and really she's just avoiding everything to do with home. When she starts to have a series of very vivid nightmares, and when those nightmares start to become reality, she finally goes home. I love the way that this book explored themes of grief and family. It was really poignant. I thought the magical realism was really well done. Overall, I really loved this book, and considering it was a debut novel, it just makes it all the more special. Number 13 was The September House by Carissa Orlando. This was a book that was recommended to me by Jamie Kate. Look, I love a good horror book, but I haven't found too many good haunted house horror books. This is that exception. I devoured this book. We have a main character who is unique. She has finally bought the house of her dreams, and then she finds out it's haunted. And instead of freaking out and selling the house and running away, she just makes peace with the ghosts, and they exist happily together. Whatever the house asks of her, she does, and everything is harmonious. That is until her husband disappears and her daughter comes to visit and hopefully investigate what happened to her father. This causes a bunch of turbulence within the house and things start to implode. This was definitely the most unique piece of horror that I've ever read. There is a lot of humor involved in it. There's some mystery elements. I thought one thing was happening for part of the book and then realized, no, that's not happening. Something else is happening. I had all sorts of wild theories about what was going on. It was such a fun ride. This isn't necessarily the deepest or most profound read ever, but it was probably one of the funnest reads I have on this list. Number 12 is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This was a book that I found from Shelley Swearingen on Shellyish. This is another book that could be described as a little bizarre. We have a group of women who are trapped in a cage. They don't know how they got there or why they're there. There are men guarding the cage that never speak to the women. The women are fed, given water. They're not mistreated, although they have memories of being mistreated and beaten in the past. And it's just about their existence within this cage. This definitely has some elements of a dystopian fiction, but it's a very unusual one. I don't want to say too much more than this because I don't want to spoil the surprise for anyone that hasn't read it, but this is a very unique read. I don't think I have anything else on this list of books that's quite like it. Number 11 was Never Whistle at Night, and this was a short story collection by a whole group of Indigenous authors. This was such a strong short story collection. Every single story in this book was interesting to me. I liked some better than others for sure, but there wasn't any that I was like, oh, I wish that hadn't been included in this book. I love the cover of this. I love the design. I love the whole creative process of this book. If you like a short story collection, especially one that's anchored in horror and magical realism and even a little bit of fantasy, you should definitely have this on your shelf. Number 10 was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, and this was a book I read for a collaboration that I did with Sarah from Sarah's Nightstand and Lindsay from Lindsay's Little Library. And this was a 5-star prediction video. I picked out 3 books that I thought were going to be 5 stars, and this was one of them. And it definitely was a 5-star read for me. I mean, there's no real surprise here. Kristen Hanna is an excellent historical fiction writer, and this was probably one of her most well-known and well-loved books. This book follows 2 sisters who are trapped in France as the Nazis take over during World War II, and it kind of shows us the different choices that people make to survive the war. We have one sister who, in order to keep her family home and to protect her child, shacks up with a Nazi officer. Now, she's not married. This book is about 2 sisters who are trapped in France as the Nazis take over during World War II. And it shows the different choices that they make in order to survive. One sister has a farm and is forced to allow a Nazi officer to stay there. And she is put into an extraordinarily precarious situation because she has to constantly watch her every move to try to make sure that, he doesn't cause her any problems. The other sister is a bit more rebellious and she toes the line the entire time. This was a book that stuck with me. Both characters are really well written. The setting is really well done. The pacing is really well done. This is a really emotional read, and overall, I think if you're a historical fiction lover, if you haven't already read this, you definitely should. Number 9 is When the Angels Left the Old Country by Sacha. This was a book that I found on NetGalley. I had never heard of this author, had no idea what this is about. I was actually honestly drawn in by the neon orange cover. It just was calling to me. And this was such a lucky find. This is a book about an angel and a demon who leave the shtetl to head to New York City because one of their town members is possibly in danger, and they just want to make sure that she's okay. This book is fascinating. I know Hannah at Savage Reads read this one as well, and she compared it to Bad Omens, which I could definitely see that comparison. But for me, this was more vivid and alive. I just really loved it. It was funny, it was interesting, it was anchored in history really well. If you like historical fiction, if you like fantasy, if you like Jewish cultural elements, I think that this is a fantastic read. Number 8 is How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz. This is a book that was recommended to me by my friend Allie over at Allie Loves to Read on Instagram, and I am so glad that she told me to pick this one up. Also so glad that I heard that I should listen to this on audiobook. I am going to give you that same advice here. If you're gonna pick this book up, don't physically pick it up as an audiobook and listen to it, because the narration of the story makes it so much better. We have a Dominican American woman who loses her job due to the recession, and she goes to the unemployment office seeking work. The story is told through a series of interviews with the unemployment officers that are trying to help her find her job. I love this book because our main character isn't a character that's often portrayed in fiction. We have an older Dominican woman in New York City who's lost her job, her world's turned upside down, she's kind of afloat, and she has nothing to really anchor her at the moment. I just thought it was such a unique perspective and handled so well. Number 7 is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is the second of the 3 books that I picked from my 5-star prediction video, and this was also a 5-star read. This is another World War II historical fiction, and it is set in France as the Nazis invade. We have a young blind woman who is in the village of Saint-Malo, and her father is basically trying to teach her how to survive. There's all sorts of other things that are going on, but that's like the general gist of the story. We have such an interesting main character. All of the side characters in this are so well fleshed out and so memorable. Life in San Malo is so vivid, and it just, the whole book really comes to life. This is a fantastic story. If you're a fan of historical fiction and you haven't read this one somehow, because I feel like I was like the last person on earth to read it. But if somehow I'm not the last person on earth to have read it, you should definitely read it as well. Number 6 is a classic, which is a big surprise to me, and that's Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is a heartbreaker of a book. If you don't want to feel sad, then don't read this book, because I borderline cried at the end of this. Our main character is a person that has a low IQ. He has a job working in a bakery, but he doesn't have a lot going on in his life, and people are really cruel to him, and we see that through his eyes, except he doesn't always pick up that they're being cruel to him. He thinks that everyone that's bullying him and making fun of him are his friends. And then he is enrolled in a scientific experiment where his IQ is enhanced, and suddenly he becomes a genius. And now he's looking at his life and the people around him and realizing how lonely and isolated he is. And then the experiment proves to not necessarily be successful, and he starts to experience some challenges with his intellect. It is just heartbreaking. This book is written as if it's a diary, like he's taking notes on, his experiment and his thoughts throughout it. I am not somebody who usually gravitates towards classics, but if you're like me and kind of hesitant about classics, this is a great place to dip your toes into the water. Number 5 was Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. This is the story of several women who survive a serial killer. Now, the serial killer that is being referenced in this book is very well known, but one thing that I really love that was done in this book was that the serial killer is never named nor mentioned. Occasionally, he's referred to by nickname, like the All-American Killer, but he's never really focused on. The focus instead is on the victims. And we also get a focus on how the media treats victims in the aftermath of crime. This book had lots to say about how women are often blamed for their own attacks. What were you wearing? Did you maybe give this man the wrong impression? Did you possibly somehow subtly hint that you wanted him to break into your house and murder your friends? And it's also really critical of the police response to female victims and how police often don't take women seriously when we're giving details and information. This was a fantastic book. It was a fast read. It was really thoughtfully done. I can't recommend this enough. Number 4 is a book that I banged on about all year long, and that is The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This is just a good old-fashioned pirate story, and it is so much fun. The thing that makes it special is that our MC is a middle-aged woman. She's raising a child, she's retired, she doesn't want to be a pirate anymore, but she gets dragged back into that pirate life. This was such a vivid, fun, enjoyable book. We have the high seas, we have a really interesting crew, and everybody is so well fleshed out. We have very real danger, we have an actual conflict. Everything about it was so much fun. I cannot rave about this book enough, and considering how heavy the majority of the books on my list are, if you need a lighter, more fun read, this is one to pick up. Number 3 is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This is a book that I think you're either going to love or hate. I don't think that there's like a middle ground for this one. It is a very, very strange book, and it is also really heavy with trigger warnings, so do your research before jumping into this. We have a Korean woman who decides that she's going to become vegetarian because she's been having bloody nightmares about meat and death and all this gore. Her family is really upset with her decision, and they repeatedly try to force her to consume meat. They try to trick her, they try to physically force her. It gets really, really ugly. And the more that they try to force her, the more that she resists and protests. This book says so much about women and our role in society, bodily autonomy, rape culture, societal norms, all sorts of complex themes. I have an entire review on this book right up here, and I talk about a lot of that there. But honestly, this is a book where the farther I am away from reading this, the more I keep coming up with things that this book could have signified and could have meant. This is honestly a fantastic book. I think if you read it, even though it's short, read it slowly, read a little bit, try to take it in, think about it, and then read a little bit more. Don't rush through this. There's so much packed into it. Number 2 is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katua. This is a book about Syria. We have a young woman, and she is trapped in Syria as the war is raging. She's working in a hospital. She doesn't have a ton of formal training, but all the doctors are gone. So she's there and she's doing the absolute best that she can, but she's under an extraordinary amount of pressure. She has a pregnant family member that she's trying to protect. She's trying to help the hospital. She, feels duty bound to try to help the citizens of her country. And yet she's also falling apart. And, she's experiencing all of this trauma, but with no time to process any of it. The writing in this book was phenomenal. Honestly, I'm getting chills talking about it right now. It is a book that has haunted me since. Every time that somebody asks for a recommendation, this is one of the first things that I think of. This was so beautifully written, so expertly handled, just a fantastic book. I am not somebody that frequently cries from books. I am not like an outwardly emotional person very often, but this is a book that actually did cause me to cry a little bit upon completing it. It is such an emotional read and so well done. Book number 1 is a book that I have made absolutely no secret about really loving, and that was Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a dystopian fiction about the criminal justice system in the United States. The for-profit prison system has taken just one tiny step forward, and now instead of just locking people away and exploiting them, we have a gladiator type system where we force prisoners to fight each other to the death for the tiny little chance that they might earn their freedom. We have 2 women, Hammer Hurricane Stax and Loretta Thurwar, and they are 2 of the top gladiators within the system. Both of them are brutal and vicious and look like they have a legitimate chance at earning their freedom. There's just one problem: they're also lovers. And it seems inevitable that they're going to be forced into the arena with each other sooner or later. I can't say enough positive things about this book. I thought that this was such a sharp critique of the prison industrial complex that we have here in the United States. And I think that it probably isn't too far from the prison industrial complex in other countries as well. This was just a searing critique. There was so much in this book to love. There is a very straightforward narrative, and then we have some chapters that are a little bit more literary and kind of out there. There was a lot of really interesting stylistic choices. All of the characters in this were so well developed. I felt all of the emotions that I think that this author would want someone to feel when reading this type of book. Anger, frustration, sadness, resentment, a desire to fix it before it gets this bad. I know that my voice is really small in comparison to the critical feedback that this book is getting, which has been overwhelmingly positive. It's been nominated for all sorts of awards, and it's the book of the year for the Aardvark Book Club. I actually just got a signed special edition copy through Aardvark, which I'm really excited about. But for me, this was definitely my favorite read of the year. It stood out to me. I devoured this book when I read it, and I haven't stopped thinking about it or shouting about it since. If you haven't read this one yet, especially if you like a dystopian fic that has a lot of relevant themes and is really critical of our current prison system, then I think you should definitely pick this up. I also just wanted to mention a couple other things. My favorite series of the year was the Arc of Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. I read all 4 books of this and it was fantastic. Book 1 and book 2 were definitely the strongest. Book 3, I didn't necessarily love the ending all the way. I think there were some different things that could have been done, but overall as an entire series, I thought that this one was fantastic. I also read a handful of middle grade books this year, which I did not include in my possibility for 23 favorites, just because I think it's hard to rank a middle grade book against an adult book. But my 2 favorite middle grade books this year were When You Trap a Tiger by Tay Keller, which is a story that uses Korean mythology to explore grief and is a book that handles some really difficult topics in a very smart way. While I realize that it's geared towards children, I feel like adults could read this book and benefit from it as well. And the second one was The Last Cuentista by Dana Barba Higuera. This is kind of a science fiction novel about the importance of storytelling, and we have a blind character who is on a ship that is escaping Earth and going towards a different future out in the universe. This was also beautifully done. I loved the theme of storytelling in this book, and I think this would be a fantastic read for a middle grader. So those are all of my statistics and all of my favorites for 2023. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, watch out for my video tomorrow, which is going to be my 23 least favorite reads of 2023. And if you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know, have you read any of the books on this list, what were your favorite reads of 2023? Are any of these books on this list books that you absolutely hated and you can't believe that I put them on my favorites list? Tell me all of the things. I want all of the reactions and all of the information. And if you're not already subscribed to my channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.